The photograph was taken on the morning of October 14, 1897, in a hollow so deep within the Appalachian Mountains that sunlight reached it for only 4 hours each day. The woman in the image stands before a weathered cabin, her hands folded at her waist, her expression frozen somewhere between patience and exhaustion. She wears a dark wool dress, buttoned to the throat despite the season. Her hair, pulled back severely, reveals a face that might once have been beautiful, but now carries the particular hollowness of someone who has learned to endure rather than to live. Her name was Miriam Suttles. She was 31 years old, and in less than 6 months she would be dead. But none of that is why this photograph has survived for more than a century. None of that explains why it has been studied by historians, criminologists, and psychologists across 3 generations. None of that accounts for its presence in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, filed under a classification that reads simply, Evidence, Case, 1898, Rio 047. The reason this photograph has endured, the reason you are hearing about it now, is because of what appears in the window behind Miriam Suttles, or more precisely, what appears in the reflection. At first glance, the window seems to show nothing unusual. The glass is old, warped in the way of hand-blown panes from that era, creating subtle distortions in whatever it reflects. The interior of the cabin behind it is dark, revealing only vague shapes that might be furniture, might be shadows, might be nothing at all. The photographer, a traveling portrait artist named Edmund Carey, had positioned Miriam with her back to the cabin specifically to capture the morning light on her face. He was thinking about composition, about the play of shadow and illumination that would make his work stand out from the crude daguerreotypes still common in these remote mountain communities. Edmund Carey was not thinking about windows, he was not thinking about reflections, and he certainly was not thinking about what those reflections might accidentally preserve. The photograph remained in Miriam Suttles' possession for the remainder of her short life. After her death in March of 1898, it passed to her husband, Josiah Suttles, along with the cabin, the 40 acres of rocky hillside surrounding it, and the debts that would eventually force him to sell everything to a logging company from Virginia. The photograph was found among his effects when he died in 1923, stored in a tobacco tin along with a lock of hair, a wedding band, and a letter that had never been opened. It was Josiah's granddaughter, Martha Suttles Coleman, who first noticed something wrong with the image. By then it was 1962, and Martha was sorting through family artifacts in preparation for donating them to the newly established Appalachian Heritage Center in Berea. She was 73 years old, her eyesight failing, and she might never have seen anything at all if she hadn't happened to examine the photograph under the magnifying glass she used for reading. What Martha saw made her drop the glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor of her living room in Louisville, and she did not pick up the pieces for 3 days. Instead, she sat in her chair by the window, holding the photograph, staring at the reflection that had hidden in plain sight for 65 years. In the window behind Miriam Suttles, barely visible through the warped glass and the accumulated dust of decades, there was a face. It was not Miriam's face reflected back. It was not the photographer's face, which would have been impossible given his position. It was the face of a young woman. A girl, really, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, pressed against the inside of the glass. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open, her expression one of such desperate, pleading terror that even through the distortions of time and glass and photographic chemistry, her fear was unmistakable. She was looking directly at the camera, directly at Edmund Carey. Directly, it seemed, at anyone who might one day look at this photograph and finally see her. Martha Coleman contacted the Kentucky State Police the following morning. She was transferred 4 times before reaching a detective who was willing to listen to an elderly woman's story about a face in a 65-year-old photograph. His name was Harold Pennington, and he had been working cold cases for 11 years. He had learned in that time that the strangest leads sometimes produced the most disturbing truths. Detective Pennington drove to Louisville that afternoon. He examined the photograph under proper lighting, with proper equipment, and confirmed what Martha Coleman had seen. There was indeed a face in the window. There was indeed a young woman inside that cabin, pressing herself against the glass at the exact moment Edmund Carey had triggered his shutter. The question that would consume the next 3 years of Harold Pennington's life, the question that would eventually cost him his marriage, his career, and very nearly his sanity, was simple. Who was she? The Suttles cabin had burned to the ground in 1931, struck by lightning during a summer storm. The land had been logged, replanted, logged again, and was now part of a national forest. Whatever evidence might have existed within those walls had been reduced to ash and scattered by wind and rain and the relentless erosion of mountain time. The official records from Harlan County in 1897 were sparse at best, having survived 2 courthouse fires and a flood. Census data was incomplete. Birth and death certificates from that era were often informal, recorded in family Bibles rather than government ledgers. But Harold Pennington was patient. And Harold Pennington was thorough. And most importantly, Harold Pennington understood something that younger detectives often forgot. In Appalachia, the mountains remember what the records do not. The stories passed down through generations, whispered around kitchen tables, murmured in church pews, confessed on deathbeds. If someone wanted to know what had happened in the Suttles cabin in 1897, they did not need documents. They needed to find the right people and ask the right questions. It took him 14 months to find Eliza Combs. She was 91 years old when Detective Pennington located her in a nursing home in Pikeville, Kentucky. Her mind wandered between decades, sometimes speaking to visitors as if they were people who had died before the First World War. But on her clear days, and she still had clear days, Eliza Combs remembered everything. She remembered because she had grown up 3 hollows over from the Suttles place. She remembered because her mother had been Miriam Suttles' only friend. She remembered because, on the night of March 7, 1898, she had been the one to find Miriam's body. She was 8 years old at the time. Some memories, she told Detective Pennington, you carry until they carry you into the grave. Eliza Combs spoke for 4 hours. Detective Pennington recorded every word. And when she was finished, when her voice had faded to a whisper and her eyes had closed with exhaustion, Harold Pennington sat in his car in the nursing home parking lot and wept. He wept because he finally knew who the girl in the window was. He wept because he finally understood what had happened in that cabin, and he wept because Eliza Combs had told him something else, something that transformed this case from a historical curiosity into an active investigation, something that meant the story of the Suttles cabin was not finished, something that meant even in 1963, there was still justice to be served. The girl in the window had a name. Her name was Patience Whitmore. She had disappeared from a farm in Tennessee in the summer of 1896. She was 14 years old, and according to Eliza Combs, she was not the only one. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every week we unearth forgotten stories that history tried to bury, stories of courage, tragedy, and truth that deserve to be remembered. If you believe these voices matter, join us. Subscribe now and become part of a community dedicated to ensuring the past is never silenced. To understand what happened in the Suttles cabin, you must first understand the world that surrounded it. The Appalachian Mountains in the final years of the 19th century were a place of profound isolation, profound poverty, and profound silence. The railroads had not yet reached these remote hollows. The coal companies were only beginning their long, devastating conquest of the region. The federal government was a distant abstraction, as relevant to daily life as the politics of ancient Rome. In places like Harlan County, authority was local. Justice was personal. And secrets could remain buried for generations, protected by geography, by loyalty, and by the simple fact that no one from the outside world ever thought to look. Josiah Suttles had arrived in the hollow that would eventually bear his name in the spring of 1889. He was 26 years old, recently discharged from a logging crew in Virginia, and possessed of a small inheritance from an uncle who had died without children. He used the money to purchase 40 acres of land that no one else wanted, too steep for farming, too remote for commerce, accessible only by a single trail that wound through 3 miles of dense forest before connecting to the nearest road. It was, in other words, the perfect place for a man who did not want to be found. The locals knew little about Josiah Suttles and cared to know less. He was not from the mountains, which made him an outsider. He kept to himself, which made him suspicious. And he had money, which made him dangerous in a place where most families survived on what they could grow, hunt, or barter. When he built his cabin, larger than necessary for a single man, with a cellar dug deep into the hillside, the neighbors noticed. When he installed iron bars on the cellar windows, they noticed that too. But noticing was not the same as asking, and asking was not the same as interfering. In Appalachia, a man's business was his own until it became everyone's problem. Miriam arrived 2 years later in the autumn of 1891. She came from somewhere in Ohio. The exact location varied depending on who told the story, and she came as Josiah's wife, though no one could remember a wedding and no one had ever seen a marriage certificate. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with the pale complexion and refined manners of someone who had not grown up in these mountains. She spoke rarely and smiled never. When she accompanied Josiah to the general store in the valley, she stood slightly behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white through her skin. Eliza Combs's mother, a woman named Sarah who had herself escaped an abusive husband before remarrying into the Combs family, recognized the signs immediately. She began finding excuses to visit the Suttles' cabin, bringing preserves, offering to help with mending, asking to borrow tools that she did not need. Miriam accepted these visits with a gratitude that she struggled to hide. Over time, a friendship developed. It was a careful friendship, conducted always within earshot of Josiah, always within the boundaries of what he would permit. But it was a friendship nonetheless, and for Miriam Suttles, it was the only connection to humanity that her husband had not managed to sever. Sarah Combs learned, over the following years, the shape of Miriam's suffering. She learned that Josiah controlled every aspect of his wife's existence: what she ate, what she wore, when she slept, where she walked. She learned that Miriam was not permitted to leave the property unaccompanied. She learned that the cellar beneath the cabin was kept locked at all times, and that Miriam did not have a key. She learned that some nights, when the wind was quiet and the hollow fell silent, sounds emerged from beneath that cabin that Miriam would not explain and Sarah did not dare to ask about. But Sarah Combs was a practical woman. She had survived her own nightmare and understood that survival sometimes meant waiting, watching, and choosing your moment with care. She could not rescue Miriam Suttles. She could not challenge Josiah without bringing disaster upon her own family. What she could do was bear witness. What she could do was remember. What she could do was ensure that if the moment for action ever arrived, she would be ready. That moment came in the summer of 1896, when Josiah Suttles returned from one of his unexplained absences with something he had never brought home before: a girl. Her name, as Harold Pennington would eventually confirm through painstaking research, was Patience Whitmore. She was the daughter of a tenant farmer in eastern Tennessee, one of 7 children in a family that could barely feed 5. She had disappeared in June of 1896, shortly after her 14th birthday, and her family had assumed she had run away, perhaps to find work in a mill town, perhaps to escape the grinding poverty that defined their existence. They had not searched for her. They had not reported her missing. In the harsh calculus of rural poverty, one less mouth to feed was not always a tragedy. Patience. Whitmore did not run away. Patience Whitmore was taken, and she was not the first. What Detective Pennington eventually pieced together through interviews with elderly residents and examination of fragmentary records was a pattern that stretched back to Josiah Suttles' arrival in the hollow. Every year or two, Josiah would leave the mountain for several weeks. He told neighbors he was visiting family in Virginia. He told others he was looking for work. The explanations varied, but the pattern was consistent. He would leave alone and return alone. His wagon, however, would be heavier on the return journey. And in the weeks following his return, smoke would rise from the cabin chimney at unusual hours, and the sounds from the cellar would intensify. No one had connected these patterns. No one had thought to ask what Josiah Suttles was bringing back from his journeys. No one had wondered why a man with no apparent income could afford to maintain a property and a wife in a region where most families struggled to survive. Josiah Suttles was not visiting family. Josiah Suttles was not looking for work. Josiah Suttles was hunting. The girls he took were always the same type: young, poor, from families large enough or desperate enough that one missing child would not trigger a search. He found them in Tennessee, in Virginia, in the distant hollows of Kentucky where his face was not known. He approached them with offers of employment, a position in a wealthy household, a job in a mill town, an opportunity that seemed too good to refuse. And when they accepted, when they climbed into his wagon with their small bundles of possessions and their enormous hopes for a better life, they disappeared from the world. The cellar beneath the Suttles' cabin became their prison. How many passed through its darkness, Detective Pennington could never determine with certainty. The evidence suggested at least 5 over the 7 years before Patience Whitmore's arrival. Some remained for months. Some remained for years. None, as far as Pennington could determine, ever left alive. What happened to them in that cellar, what Josiah Suttles did to them, what he forced Miriam to witness, what role she played in their captivity and their eventual deaths, these questions haunted Harold Pennington for the rest of his life. The answers existed only in fragments. Eliza Combs' childhood memories of screams that echoed through the hollow, the testimony of a now-deceased neighbor who had once glimpsed a young woman through a gap in the cellar door, the contents of a journal that Miriam Suttles kept hidden in the walls of the cabin, recovered by archaeologists in 1987 during an excavation of the site. That journal, written in a cramped and desperate hand, documented Miriam's growing horror at what her husband had become. She had married Josiah believing him to be a stern but respectable man, a farmer seeking a wife to help build a life in the wilderness. She had not known about his previous activities, about the darkness that lived beneath his careful exterior, about the cellar that would become her prison as surely as it became the prison of his victims. By the time she understood the truth, it was too late. By the time she recognized what the sounds from the cellar meant, she was trapped. Josiah had made clear, in terms that left no room for doubt, what would happen to her if she ever attempted to leave, ever attempted to speak, ever attempted to interfere with his work. She had seen what he was capable of. She had seen what remained of the girls who displeased him, and so she remained silent, complicit in crimes that destroyed her soul one day at a time. Until Patience Whitmore arrived. Until Edmund Carey came to take his photograph. Until everything changed. Edmund Carey was 24 years old in the autumn of 1897, a traveling photographer working his way through the Appalachian region with a wagon full of equipment and a head full of ambitions. He had studied his craft in Cincinnati, apprenticing under a German immigrant who had learned the art in Europe, and he dreamed of documenting the vanishing world of the mountain people before modernization erased their distinctive culture forever. He was idealistic, he was talented, and on October 14, 1897, he was in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Or perhaps, depending on how you view the events that followed, exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Edmund had spent the previous week photographing families in the valley below the Suttles' Hollow. His work had attracted attention and appreciation. These isolated communities rarely saw photographers, and the opportunity to possess a permanent image of oneself or one's family was treasured. Word of his presence spread through the network of trails and trading posts that connected the scattered settlements, and eventually, that word reached Miriam Suttles. She sent a message through Sarah Combs. She wanted her photograph taken. She would pay the standard rate. She wanted it done while her husband was away on one of his journeys. Sarah Combs delivered this message with a warning. The Suttles' place was not like other homes in these mountains. The woman who lived there was troubled. The husband was dangerous. If Edmund Carey chose to accept this commission, he should complete it quickly and ask no questions about what he might see or hear. Edmund Carey was young and ambitious, but he was not foolish. He understood that Sarah Combs was telling him something important, something she could not say directly. He also understood that refusing the commission would mean losing not just one fee, but the goodwill of the entire community that respected Sarah's judgment. And so he accepted, with the silent understanding that he would observe, remember, and perhaps one day bear witness to whatever secrets the Suttles' cabin contained. He arrived at the hollow on a morning of unusual clarity, the autumn air sharp and cold, the mountains blazing with color against a sky so blue it seemed painted. Miriam met him at the door of the cabin. She was thin, pale, dressed in her best clothing, That dark wool dress that would become famous, those shoes that had been polished until they gleamed. She had prepared for this photograph as if preparing for her own funeral portrait, which in a sense she was. Edmund set up his equipment in the clearing before the cabin. He positioned Miriam with care, adjusting her posture, directing her gaze, trying to capture something of her dignity beneath the obvious suffering. He was focused on his work, on the technical challenges of lighting and exposure, on the artistic composition that would distinguish his photograph from the crude images produced by less skilled practitioners. He did not notice the face in the window until he was developing the plate that evening. By then, he was 20 miles away, camped beside a creek in the next valley, his wagon surrounded by the darkness of the mountain night. He had brought his portable darkroom, a tent of black fabric that allowed him to process images in the field, and he had decided to develop Miriam's portrait immediately, partly from professional curiosity, partly from a vague unease that had followed him down the mountain. When the image emerged from the chemical bath, Edmund Carey dropped the plate. It shattered on the rocks beside the creek, and he spent the next hour gathering the fragments by lantern light, fitting them together like a puzzle, staring at the face that should not have been there. He had seen no one else at the Suttles' cabin. The door had been closed, the windows shuttered except for the one behind Miriam, which had been cracked open to provide ventilation in the stuffy interior. He had assumed the cabin was empty except for Miriam herself. He had assumed many things, all of them wrong. The face in the window belonged to a young girl with wide eyes and an expression of desperate hope. She was looking at the camera, looking at Edmund, with the intensity of someone who understood that this might be her only chance, her only opportunity to send a message to the outside world, her only possibility of rescue. Edmund Carey did not sleep that night. He sat beside his fire, turning the broken pieces of the photograph in his hands, trying to decide what to do. He could return to the Suttles' cabin and demand an explanation. He could go to the authorities in the valley and report what he had seen. He could pretend he had noticed nothing and continue on his journey, leaving whatever was happening in that hollow to resolve itself without his interference. He was not a brave man. He was not a foolish man. But he was a man with a conscience, and that conscience would not let him walk away. The following morning, Edmund Carey made a decision that would ultimately cost him his life, but would also, decades later, bring justice to the forgotten victims of the Suttles' cabin. He returned to the hollow, not to confront Josiah, who was still away on his journey, but to speak with Miriam alone. What passed between them during that conversation was recorded in Miriam's journal, discovered nearly a century later. Edmund Carey had shown her the broken photograph. He had pointed to the face in the window. He had asked simply and directly who that girl was and why she was trapped inside the cabin. Miriam Suttles broke down. Years of silence, years of complicity, years of horror that she had been forced to witness, all of it came pouring out in a confession that lasted for hours. She told Edmund about Josiah's true nature. She told him about the girls who had come before Patience. She told him about the cellar, about what happened there, about the graves scattered in the forest behind the cabin that no one had ever thought to search for. She told him everything, and when she was finished, she begged him to help her. She begged him to help Patience escape before Josiah returned. Edmund Carey agreed. It was the most courageous decision of his life. It was also the most dangerous. Together they formulated a plan. Edmund would return in 3 days with a wagon and supplies. Miriam would unlock the cellar while Josiah slept. They would take Patience and flee down the mountain, reaching the valley before dawn, reaching the authorities before Josiah could pursue them. It was a good plan. It might have worked. But Josiah Suttles returned early. He returned on the evening of October 17th, a full week before Miriam had expected him. He returned because a storm had washed out the roads in Tennessee, cutting short his hunting expedition. He returned to find his wife nervous, agitated, unable to meet his eyes. And Josiah Suttles, whatever else he might have been, was not a stupid man. He found Edmund Carey's business card in Miriam's dress pocket. He found the broken photograph hidden beneath a loose floorboard. And he found, in Miriam's eyes, the unmistakable look of a woman who had finally decided to betray him. What happened next was pieced together from multiple sources. Miriam's journal entries, which became increasingly frantic in the days that followed, the testimony of neighbors who heard screams echoing through the hollow, and the physical evidence discovered when the authorities finally arrived months later. Josiah did not kill Miriam immediately. That would have been too merciful, too quick, too simple for a man whose cruelty had been refined over years of practice. Instead, he locked her in the cellar with Patience Whitmore. He told her that she would share the fate of all the girls who had come before. He told her that she had chosen her side, and now she would discover what that choice meant. For 5 months, Miriam Suttles and Patience Whitmore lived together in that darkness. They survived on scraps. They comforted each other through horrors that the journal only hints at, horrors too terrible for even Miriam's desperate pen to fully describe. They prayed for rescue that did not come. They planned escapes that never materialized. They held on to hope long after hope had any right to survive. Edmund Carey, meanwhile, had not abandoned them. He had returned to the hollow on the appointed day, only to find Josiah waiting for him with a rifle. What followed was described in a letter Edmund wrote to his brother, a letter that was never sent, but was found among his possessions after his death. He did not shoot me. He wanted me to know what would happen if I spoke to anyone about what I had seen. He showed me. He took me to the edge of the forest and showed me the graves. 7 of them, small mounds of earth that could have been anything but, were not. He told me their names. He told me how long each one had survived. And then he told me that if I ever returned, if I ever spoke a word of this to any living soul, my name would be added to that count, and my grave would join theirs beneath the trees. Edmund Carey left Appalachia that night. He traveled west, eventually settling in California, where he abandoned photography and spent the rest of his life working as a clerk in a shipping office. He never spoke of what he had seen. He never returned to Kentucky. He died in 1934, alone and forgotten, carrying his guilt to a grave 3,000 miles from the hollow where he had failed to save 2 women who had trusted him. But he kept the photograph. The broken, reassembled photograph of Miriam Suttles with the face of Patience Whitmore barely visible in the window behind her. He kept it as a reminder of his cowardice. He kept it as evidence of a crime he had been too afraid to report. And when he died, it passed to his brother, and then to his brother's daughter, and eventually, through a series of estate sales and antique dealers, into the hands of Josiah Suttles' own granddaughter. The photograph had traveled across a continent and through 6 decades, only to return to the family of the man who had committed the crimes it documented. Some might call that coincidence. Others might call it something else entirely. If this story has touched something deep within you, if you feel the weight of these forgotten voices calling out across the years, then pause for a moment. Leave a comment below with these words: "Their names deserve to be remembered." Let us honor together those who history tried to silence. Miriam Suttles died on March 7, 1898. She was found by 8-year-old Eliza Combs, who had been sent by her mother to deliver a jar of preserves, a tradition that Sarah Combs had maintained even after Josiah forbade visitors, leaving the jars on a stump at the edge of the property where Miriam might find them. On that morning, Eliza found more than she had ever been prepared to see. The cabin door was open. The cellar door, which had always been locked, stood ajar. And in the clearing before the cabin, in the same spot where Edmund Carey had taken his photograph 5 months earlier, lay the body of Miriam Suttles. She had been dead for several hours. The cause of death, as determined by the county physician who examined her remains 2 days later, was exposure complicated by malnutrition, and what the doctor carefully described as evidence of prolonged physical trauma. She had escaped from the cellar, or been released, and had made it only a few steps before her body finally surrendered. Patience Whitmore was not found with her. Josiah Suttles was not found at all. When the authorities arrived, summoned by Sarah Combs, who had immediately understood the significance of what her daughter had discovered, they found the cabin abandoned. The cellar was empty except for the evidence of long habitation: worn blankets, scratched walls, fingernails embedded in the wooden doorframe where someone had clawed desperately for escape. They found Miriam's journal hidden in a space between the wall logs, its pages filled with testimony that would later prove crucial to understanding what had happened. They found the graves in the forest, exactly where Edmund Carey's unsent letter would one day describe them. But they did not find Josiah Suttles, and they did not find Patience Whitmore. The official investigation that followed was hampered by the limitations of the time and place. Harlan County in 1898 had no professional police force, no forensic capabilities, no means of pursuing a fugitive across state lines. The county sheriff, a man named Horace Begley, did what he could with the resources available. He documented the scene, interviewed neighbors, and sent telegrams to law enforcement agencies throughout the region with descriptions of Josiah Suttles and the missing girl. The telegrams produced nothing. Josiah Suttles had vanished as completely as the girls he had taken over the years, swallowed by the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where a man who wanted to disappear could do so with frightening ease. The case was officially closed in 1901, classified as unsolved. Miriam Suttles was buried in the small cemetery in the valley below her former home, her grave marked with a simple stone that bore only her name and dates. The other victims, the girls whose remains were recovered from the forest graves, were buried beside her, their stones marked only with the word unknown, because no one had ever come looking for them, no one had ever reported them missing, no one had ever cared enough to give them names. Patience Whitmore's grave was not among them. This absence haunted Sheriff Begley for the remainder of his career. He had examined the cellar carefully, had found evidence of 2 prisoners rather than 1, had read Miriam's journal entries describing her companionship with the young girl from Tennessee. He knew that Patience had been alive as recently as the week before Miriam's death. He knew that she had not died in that cellar, which meant that she had either escaped or been taken. Given what he knew about Josiah Suttles, Sheriff Begley did not believe she had escaped. He devoted the final years of his life to tracking down any information about Josiah's whereabouts after March 1898. He followed leads that took him as far as Missouri and Arkansas. He corresponded with law enforcement agencies in a dozen states. He offered rewards from his own pocket for information leading to the capture of a man who had, in all probability, continued his crimes in some new location under some new name. He died in 1912 without ever finding him. His files, meticulously maintained throughout his long pursuit, were stored in the Harlan County Courthouse and eventually transferred to the Kentucky State Archives, where they sat unexamined until Harold Pennington requested them in 1963. It was in those files that Pennington found the connection that would finally crack the case. Among Sheriff Begley's papers was a letter from a colleague in West Virginia, dated 1904. The letter described a case that had troubled law enforcement in McDowell County, a series of disappearances, young women from poor families, occurring over a period of 2 years. The circumstances were eerily similar to the pattern Begley had described in his inquiries about Josiah Suttles. The letter concluded with a name, not Josiah Suttles, but a man calling himself Jacob Sutton, who had arrived in the area in late 1898 and had purchased property in a remote hollow that sounded remarkably similar to the one he had left behind in Kentucky. Sheriff Begley had followed up on this lead. He had traveled to West Virginia in the spring of 1904, had spoken with local authorities, had even visited the property where Jacob Sutton was supposed to live. But the man had been warned of his coming, perhaps by a corrupt deputy, perhaps by the same instinct for danger that had allowed him to evade justice for so long, and had vanished before Begley arrived. The trail went cold once again. What Sheriff Begley never discovered, what Harold Pennington would finally uncover 60 years later, was that Jacob Sutton had not vanished at all. He had simply moved deeper into the mountains, into a region so remote and so lawless that even the authorities of 1904 could not reach him. He had continued his activities for another decade, protected by geography and by the silence of communities that either did not know or did not care what was happening in his cabin. He had died in 1915, not from justice but from influenza, buried in an unmarked grave by people who had never known his real name or his real history. But before he died, he had done something unexpected. Something that would not be understood until Martha Suttles Coleman brought a photograph to the attention of a detective who refused to let the dead remain silent. He had written a letter. The letter was found in 1963, hidden in the walls of a cabin in McDowell County, West Virginia. The cabin had been abandoned for decades, had passed through several owners who used it primarily for storage, and was finally scheduled for demolition to make way for a logging road. A worker dismantling the structure discovered a metal box wedged between the wall logs, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Inside the box were 3 items: a photograph of a young woman that matched the description of Patience Whitmore, a lock of dark hair tied with a faded ribbon, and a letter written in a cramped, precise hand that identified the author as Josiah Suttles. The letter was addressed to no one. It appeared to be a confession, written in the final months of its author's life, intended perhaps for a God he did not believe in or a posterity he would never see. It described in clinical detail the crimes that Josiah Suttles had committed over a period of 26 years. It named his victims, not all of them, but enough. It described their final moments with a detachment that disturbed even the hardened investigators who eventually read it. And it answered, at last, the question that had haunted Harold Pennington since his conversation with Eliza Combs. What had happened to Patience Whitmore? According to Josiah's letter, Patience had not been killed in Kentucky. She had been taken with him when he fled, bundled into his wagon in the dark hours before dawn on the same night that Miriam Suttles made her final, fatal escape attempt. She had been transported across state lines, held in a series of temporary locations, and eventually brought to the cabin in West Virginia, where Josiah established his new identity as Jacob Sutton. She had survived for 3 more years. The letter did not specify what had happened during those years. It did not need to. The pattern was already established, the horror already documented. What the letter did specify was the location of her remains, a description of the terrain, the distance and direction from the cabin, the type of tree that marked the site. Harold Pennington traveled to West Virginia in the summer of 1964. He brought with him a team of volunteers, excavation equipment, and the letter that might finally bring closure to a case that had remained open for 66 years. They found Patience Whitmore on the 3rd day of searching. Her remains were remarkably well preserved, protected by the acidic soil and the depth at which she had been buried. Among the bones, investigators found personal effects that confirmed her identity. A locket containing a photograph of her family, a carved wooden cross that matched descriptions of one she had worn since childhood, and a ring inscribed with her initials and the date of her 14th birthday. They also found something else, something that Josiah's letter had not mentioned, something that transformed this investigation from a cold case closure into one of the most significant historical discoveries of the decade. Buried with Patience Whitmore was a collection of documents, letters, diaries, and personal effects belonging to the other victims. Josiah had not merely killed these women. He had collected their memories, their words, their identities. He had kept them as trophies, souvenirs of his crimes, evidence of his power over lives he had taken. And then, for reasons known only to himself, he had buried them with his final victim. Harold Pennington spent the next 2 years working with historians, genealogists, and law enforcement agencies across the country to identify the women whose belongings had been recovered from that grave. One by one, the unknown victims received names. Margaret Collins of Tennessee, who had disappeared in 1891. Elizabeth Darcy of Virginia, missing since 1893. Ruth Ann Whitman of Kentucky, whose family had searched for her for 5 years before giving up hope. Sarah Jane Porter, Clara Mae Duncan, the list continued until it reached 11 names, 11 women whose fates had remained mysteries until the earth finally surrendered its secrets. Each identification led to a family, or what remained of one. Each family received the news that their long-lost daughter, sister, or aunt had been found. Each received the opportunity to bury their loved one properly, to mark a grave with a real name, to find the closure that had been denied them for generations. The investigation made national news. Harold Pennington was hailed as a hero, his tireless work credited with solving one of the longest-running cold cases in Kentucky history. He accepted the praise with the discomfort of a man who understood that his success had come too late to save anyone, too late to bring justice to a murderer who had died peacefully in his bed half a century earlier. But there was one more discovery to make, one more connection to draw, one more revelation that would prove that the story of Josiah Suttles was not entirely finished. Among the documents buried with Patience Whitmore was a family Bible, its pages filled with the records of births, deaths, and marriages spanning 3 generations. The Bible had belonged to one of the earlier victims, a woman named Catherine Mills who had disappeared in 1889, the same year Josiah Suttles had arrived in Harlan County. The Bible contained a family tree, and that family tree, when carefully examined, revealed a connection that no one had ever suspected. Catherine Mills had a sister. That sister had married a man named Thomas Coleman, and Thomas Coleman's granddaughter was Martha Suttles Coleman, the same Martha Coleman who had first noticed the face in the photograph, who had contacted Harold Pennington, who had set in motion the investigation that had finally brought the truth to light. The photograph had not returned to the Suttles family by coincidence. It had been guided by something that could not be explained by chance alone, the invisible thread of blood that connected the victims to their avenger, the unbroken chain of memory that had waited 3 generations for someone to finally pay attention. Martha Coleman died in 1965, 1 year after the identification of the victims was completed. She had lived just long enough to learn that her inquiry had brought justice not only to Patience Whitmore, but to her own great-aunt, a woman she had never known existed, a woman whose disappearance had never been mentioned in family histories because the shame and grief had been too great to bear. She was buried beside her husband in Louisville, her grave marked with a stone that bore the epitaph she had chosen herself. She listened to the silence. The Suttles case, as it came to be known, transformed the field of cold case investigation in ways that continue to influence law enforcement today. Harold Pennington's methodical approach, his insistence on following every lead, his willingness to listen to elderly witnesses, his understanding that the truth often survives in oral histories long after official records have been lost, became a model for investigators across the country. But the true legacy of the case lies not in its procedural innovations, but in its moral revelation. For 70 years, the victims of Josiah Suttles had been forgotten. Their families had stopped searching. Their communities had stopped asking questions. The system had failed them in life, and the system had abandoned them in death. It took a photograph, a granddaughter, and a detective who refused to give up to bring them back from the silence. Patience. Whitmore was reburied in her family's cemetery in Tennessee in the autumn of 1965. Her descendants, she had siblings who had grown old, had children, had grandchildren of their own, gathered to lay her to rest 70 years after she had been taken. The ceremony was small, private, conducted by a minister who had never met her, but who understood that some losses cannot be measured by time. The other victims were buried in a memorial cemetery established in Harlan County, on land donated by descendants of families who had lived in the shadow of the Suttles cabin. Each grave received a headstone bearing a name, a date, and the simple inscription, "Remembered." Harold Pennington attended every funeral. He stood at the back, apart from the families, a witness to the final chapter of a case that had consumed 7 years of his life. He never spoke at these ceremonies. He never sought recognition or gratitude. He understood that his role had been merely to uncover what should never have been hidden, to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. He retired from the Kentucky State Police in 1970 and spent his remaining years writing a memoir that detailed his investigation. The book was never published during his lifetime. He considered it too personal, too painful, too incomplete, but it was discovered among his papers after his death in 1988 and was eventually released by a university press under the title, "The Faces in the Window." The title referred not only to Patience Whitmore, but to all the victims, all the forgotten women whose faces had once pressed against glass, against walls, against the boundaries of their prisons, hoping that someone on the outside would see them, would hear them, would care enough to remember. The Suttles cabin site was excavated by archaeologists in 1987 as part of a broader study of 19th century Appalachian life. They found the remains of the cellar, its stone walls still standing beneath decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. They found artifacts that confirmed the accounts in Miriam's journal, chains attached to iron rings, scratches on the walls where prisoners had marked the passage of days, and a small collection of personal items that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Among those items was a final photograph, different from the one that had started the investigation. This photograph showed Josiah Suttles himself, standing before his cabin, his expression one of calm satisfaction. It had been taken by Edmund Carey on the same day he had photographed Miriam, a companion image that the photographer had apparently processed and then hidden, unable to destroy it but unwilling to let it be seen. In this photograph, Josiah Suttles looks directly at the camera. His eyes are cold, calculating, devoid of empathy. He stands with the confidence of a man who believes he will never be caught, never be held accountable, never face consequences for his actions. He was wrong. Not in his lifetime, perhaps. Not in the way that justice is supposed to work. But eventually, inevitably, the truth emerged. The victims were named. The crimes were documented. The silence was broken. And every year since 1965, on the anniversary of Patience Whitmore's reburial, descendants of the victims gather at the Memorial Cemetery in Harlan County. They place flowers on the graves. They read the names aloud. They ensure that the women who were forgotten in life will never be forgotten in death. The photograph of Miriam Suttles, the original photograph with Patience Whitmore's face visible in the window, remains in the Kentucky Historical Society archives. It is displayed occasionally during exhibitions about crime and justice in Appalachian history, always accompanied by the full story of its discovery and significance. Visitors who stand before that photograph often report a strange experience. They say that if they look closely enough, if they focus on the window behind Miriam, they can almost see the girl looking back at them, not pleading anymore, not desperate, simply present, simply waiting, simply ensuring that anyone who looks will finally see her. Some say this is merely an optical illusion, a trick of light and shadow and the power of suggestion. Others say it is something more. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps certain images carry more than what the camera captured. Perhaps certain stories refuse to end until they have been fully told. What remains certain is this. Patience Whitmore was seen. She was heard. She was remembered. And in the end, that may be the only justice any of us can truly offer the dead. If you have watched this far, it is because this story has touched you. It is because you understand that some histories must be preserved, some voices must be honored, some truths must never be allowed to fade into silence. Leave a comment below saying, "I watched until the end." Let me know that you are here, that you are listening, that you are part of this community of witnesses who believe the past deserves our attention. If this story moved you, press the like button. It costs nothing, but it helps these forgotten voices reach others who need to hear them. Share this video with someone who appreciates stories told with depth and respect, someone who understands that history is not just dates and names, but the living memory of those who came before us. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. Every week, we unearth stories that time tried to bury. Stories of courage, tragedy, and truth that illuminate who we are and where we have come from. Subscribe now and join a community dedicated to remembering what must never be forgotten. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for honoring the memory of Patience Whitmore and all those who waited so long to be seen. Until next time, remember, history does not forget. It waits.